In addition to setting off inflation across much of the Western world, after World War II, the expansion of government benefits for things like pensions and healthcare also began to strain the budget of the state itself. In Britain, for instance, between 1930 and 1980, we see the amount of government budget being spent on social spending increases from 2.2% of GDP to 17% of GDP. Now, unfortunately, not every country is as wealthy as Britain was in terms of being able to have the money to redistribute. And this led to countries which did not have the same kinds of resources to ultimately stretch their societies in a serious way that ultimately led to instability in some places. In one in particular, in 1981 in Chile, we see a military coup that overthrew the socialist government that had been in place and offering relatively generous social benefits to its citizens. Now, this is not in any way to provide cover for Pinochet and the variety of thugs that disappeared tens of thousands of Chileans. This is only to point out that one particular modification they made to the structure of Chile's welfare state has become an enduring feature of Western-style pensions. And therefore, it's worth considering this particular example, despite the horrors that the military government in Chile unleashed on its own citizens as well. So beginning in 1981, what we saw were that individual workers were motivated or incentivized to start contributing to individual retirement accounts from their payroll. Now, these individual retirement accounts also included a life and disability insurance, but what was most important about these individual accounts is that it ultimately shifted responsibility to the workers as opposed to the beneficiary for providing for the workers post-retirement. Prior to the military coup in Chile, the pension system had been particularly generous and was not tied at all to the kinds of contributions that people were making. So people who had only worked for 15 years were receiving the same pension as those who had worked and contributed for 30, for instance. And ultimately, this was leading to a significant underfunding of the system, as those who weren't contributing sufficiently were still drawing the same size of benefits as those who had worked their whole lives for them. So this particular change, a move away from a government-defined benefit plan towards an individualized contribution-based model, turned out to be particularly valuable, not only because it shifted the incentive of the workers towards simply or towards contributing more for their own well-being as opposed to simply showing up, but what also happened is that it encouraged people to save more to ensure that they themselves would be able to provide for their retirement income. Within 9 years, 70% of the country had made the voluntary transition to this new system, and similar plans were ultimately introduced for health insurance. Now, what's important to note about this system is that it was widely adopted across Western worlds as a new model for government-based pension plans, one whereby individuals would draw benefits commensurate with the contributions that they made. In this way, there was a link that was reestablished between efforts and rewards, or savings and future prosperity. Now, of course, this sort of system that provided for individual worker accounts doesn't necessarily solve all of the problems, which means, of course, that we needed to adapt this system a little bit further. For instance, those people who still were unemployed, or people who were casual workers generally weren't covered by these sorts of systems. So governments often try to set up minimum standards for everyone to help make up for any sort of individual shortfalls. And this sort of idea of a floor benefit for everybody, but a ceiling on benefits, which is largely determined by individual contributions, turns out to have been a relatively successful model that has been widely adopted around the world, at least in the Western world, for the last 30 years. Now, while most state-sponsored plans are still making defined benefit contributions backed by pay-go funding, the defined contribution, or DC model, that we see first emerging in Chile in the early 1980s spread much more rapidly among corporate sponsors. Between 1995 and 2014, Canadians who had DB plans fell in number from 4.6 to 4.4 million, while those who had employer-sponsored defined contribution plans roughly doubled their numbers from 520,000 to almost 1.04 million in that 20-year period. Now, the defined contribution system does come with certain advantages and certain disadvantages. One of the big advantages ultimately is that the plans are more portable than a defined benefit, which is specifically tied to an employer. In a world where people might work, for a single employer during their entire careers, a DB plan made a lot of sense. But for people who will work for 5, 6, 7 employers over their 40-year career, it's less clear that a defined benefit being paid from each one of these plan sponsors would necessarily be appropriate for such people, let alone would it necessarily provide for a simple integrated plan that would ultimately enable them to fend off poverty in their old age. So this portable sort of design that allows you to effectively stack the pension contributions from all of your employers and throughout your entire career does provide workers with a bit more security, especially in a world where we don't have the same employer for our entire lives. Now, in terms of management, we also see another potential area for improvement here, because traditionally DB-sponsored plans were often managed by the sponsor themselves. Instead, under a DC plan, sponsors do not manage the savings at all, and instead they farm this particular function out to third-party investment firms who offer their own products to beneficiaries. Now, the downside to this, of course, is that beneficiaries are left being stuck with having to make their own portfolio allocations. One of the issues is that people just don't have enough financial education to know what is reasonable to expect or what's a reasonable product that will meet their needs. Secondly, we've found that the tendency towards offering investors a huge number of potential options actually reduces the rate at which people sign up for pensions in the workplace. And this suggests that employees actually prefer fewer to more options. The data suggested that when people were offered more and more options, they actually found themselves in a position of being paralyzed by the amount of analysis. People's regret avoidance of wanting to avoid not picking the best option led them in some cases to actually pick no option, which meant that they weren't even collecting on the contributions made by their employers. And so this is a real concern in terms of design. But I think it's also important to consider the education level in terms of financial education for individual workers who are ultimately being asked to accept the risk of underperformance themselves and to accept the risk of longevity, whereas the sponsors traditionally carried these sorts of risks. Now, one of the other interesting problems that emerges as we begin to adopt more and more defined contribution pensions is what people have described as the double burden. The double burden ultimately boils down to the fact that defined contribution plans are very worthwhile to develop if you have the 40 years necessary to build up the fully funded pension scheme. On the other hand, when most pensions were introduced at the state level, they were defined benefit plans that were being funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, meaning that there was no asset base to support existing retirees, that this relied entirely on current workers. Well, given that we haven't canceled defined benefit plans, even though we're rolling out defined contribution plans, what's happening is that there is a demographic tier of people who find themselves not only having to contribute to their own defined contribution pension plans, they are simultaneously also contributing to the defined benefit plans that are being used to pay for their current elders. Now, this has raised a lot of questions related to intergenerational justice about whether or not current workers are paying their own way and paying for the way of those who came before them. But this goes back and highlights an important concern that was mentioned in some of the earlier videos, which was that elected officials are very keen to offer promises related to issues which they won't be around to clean up. And this is something that we have to be mindful of as voters. Always be willing to scrutinize the kinds of promised benefits that are being offered, because whether you're being asked to pay for them now or with your taxes in the future, ultimately, someone pays for all of this. Now, there are other variants to the pension plan that have different countries have attempted to roll out for different kinds of reasons. One of these recent variants is what's called a notionally defined contribution plan, or an NDC plan. And this is designed to help certain countries overcome their demographic collapse. For instance, in Estonia, the population has fallen by as much as 20% since the end of the Cold War, meaning, of course, that there are fewer and fewer people to support the aging retirees in their country. And usually the people that move out of the country are not old retirees who are collecting on their government benefits. They're young people who are seeking more opportunities abroad.
So systematically, countries like Estonia have found that the workers they were expecting to have in place to support their tier of retirees simply don't exist. And as a result, the state finds itself having to bend over in awkward positions to attempt to meet these obligations that they've made to a current swath of retirees who are also the voters who remain in their country. Therefore, the NDC system was invented. And we see this actually being used in countries like Italy today, which are also suffering from the same kind of demographic problem as their population peaks and has actually begun to decline already. In an NDC system, the plans don't actually set aside your money for your benefits in the future. Instead, the contributions that you make today are simply handed out to current retirees in a pay-go-style financing. But the amount of your contributions is tracked such that the benefit you will eventually draw from is based off of a notionally defined rate of return that is applied to your contributions. So in this way, the benefit that you collect is scaled to the level of contributions you have, but there's no need for actual fund management because there are no current funds that are left in the system. They're all paid out on a pay-as-you-go basis to current retirees. Now, what rate of return do we index this to? Typically speaking, it's tied to some kind of measure of macroeconomic growth, something like the country's GDP or the total amount of wages that have been paid in the country. And this way, when we see changes in demographics, in terms of, say, the level of population or the life expectancy, you see changes in the payouts that occur as well. In general, as populations decline, we would expect GDP or total wages paid in the country to decline as well, and therefore payouts decline, as does the rate of growth on people's savings. When people's life expectancy increases, payouts decrease because the notion is that there was only a fixed amount of your contribution to be had that will need to be stretched over a larger number of periods. And the transparency of this system encourages people to work longer when they can see these kinds of problems beginning to emerge. In this way, there's a lot less of a strict benefit that's being offered to people. And the benefit is ultimately tied to the nation's ability to meet its obligations based off of some proxy for the size of the country's macroeconomy and thus its tax base. Another potential variant that follows this sort of path is one that has been floated around in the last couple of years called a target benefit or a shared risk plan. These are effectively defined benefit plans, but which have a bit of wiggle room provided for the beneficiaries in that they have a benefit they would like to be able to pay out in the future, but that this largely depends on contributions and the returns earned by the plan's sponsor. So effectively, it is a promise that we will set aside some money and we will invest it, but we can't promise that the investments will go well, and therefore we don't actually make a promise about the magnitude of the pension that you'll actually earn. Now, this kind of pension plan did grow in popularity a little bit in the Netherlands after the tech bubble burst, but New Brunswick, a little bit closer to home, actually adopted one of these in 2012 for rollout at the provincial level. Now, of course, in order to supplement these state-backed plans, in a shade of what we saw in Chile in 1981, many governments have created, in the last 4 decades, they call individual pension plans. In Canada, we know these as the RRSP system. In the United States, they're referred to as 401k plans, which refers to the section of the tax code that allows them to build these individual retirement accounts. You may also, for instance, note that these individual pension funds don't actually offer any kind of guarantees on the payouts that they might provide. What they do instead is provide a tax incentive for people to save for their own futures and to thereby rely less on pension plan sponsors, whether these are government or employers. Now, even though there is a tax incentive for people to contribute to these individual pension funds, we felt it was important to put some limitations on exactly what people could do with these assets. So in your RRSP, for instance, you'll find that you can't speculate on oil futures, or you can't necessarily invest your retirement savings into hedge funds. But at the same time, your asset pools that are held for retirement are also protected from creditors in the event of bankruptcy. But just like a defined contribution plan, Individual accounts ultimately have to make their own choices about allocation, and they ultimately carry the risk of underperformance. So in this way, what we notice is that over the last 50 years, there's been a bit of a shift away from the notion that a sponsor will take care of the elderly towards one where the sponsor enables the elderly to largely take care of themselves. How people will feel about this as we move towards significant demographic inversion in the next couple of decades may very well change these designs, and we may see a new design emerging entirely. Stay tuned.